through the agenda, specifically what we want to accomplish from the staff's perspective, and then obviously we'll open it up for questions for everybody, is to go through, as it relates to the town center development, what estimates are on ongoing revenues and expenses, one-time revenues and expenses, some level of dialogue that if in fact this town center doesn't happen, and this is how we budget, that the town center at this point isn't going to happen, what are the long-term financial ramifications townwide of that particular project. Those first three items that we just talked about, or that I just brought up, were discussed at the board meeting on June 10th. So those of you who may have seen that, it's going to be a similar type of presentation. So we'll go through that hopefully relatively quickly, but not too quick. After that point in time, we're going to be talking about some financing mechanisms we're considering to use to help pay for public infrastructure. They're terms like urban renewal authority and tax increment financing. So we'll get into those particular topics. What we'd like to do, recognizing probably everyone in this room has maybe different levels of interest and sophistication, is we'd like to just generally go through this particular presentation. And then at the end, obviously open it up for whatever questions you have on any or all of these particular topics, if that makes sense. And then not only with these particular topics, but if there's any other financial related items that we don't talk about or that Jeff and I don't bring up initially, we'd be more than happy to chat about those particular items. But again, what we're talking about here are financial related issues. We're not talking about what the board has been considering over the last couple of meetings, talking about the PD process or the plan development process, the planning side, the land use side. We're just trying to focus on the finance side, because I think that's where my area of expertise ends, and some may even question how proficient it is there. No, but we'll get through this stuff. So again, we are broadcasting this live, so not only on web stream, but it'll be on Channel 8. So when we get to the question and answer period, if I could ask if you could saunter up to the microphone, just so folks who want to view this online or view it later hear the questions and hear the responses. It's not a formal process, not a public hearing as it relates to the board, and the restriction of limiting your comments to 5 minutes. But my guess is there are going to be more questions than comments. But if you could just be conscious of some general time parameters. You don't necessarily have to state your name or address, anything like that. In as much as we can try to personalize any responses that or questions you may have. Certainly feel free to. But if you're not comfortable stating names or addresses, that's fine as well. All this information, this particular PowerPoint, all the other documents that the town board and the planning commission have been considering since March. They've had 8 meetings actually to date on a number of these particular topics. All that's on the town website. So if you want to go to the home page, there's a line there that talks about town center development, and it'll break out the different topical items, land use items, finance items. So again, we'll have all these items on the web page. My guess is there'll probably be a number of questions. We'll probably be able to actually answer some of those questions tonight. There'll probably be some questions that we'll need follow-up on. Those follow-up questions, what Jeff and I will do is collectively post those questions as well as the answers. Those will appear on the web page as well. So that's our mechanism, obviously, to follow up with any follow-up items that we need, if that makes sense. Jeff, am I kind of missing anything from the standpoint of setting expectations here?
Nope, I think you do.
Okay. Any questions before we jump into it? Does anyone kind of disagree with the process, or does that seem reasonable?
Would you be able to submit a list of questions to you?
So the question was, will you be able to submit questions maybe that aren't addressed at tonight's meeting to town staff? Absolutely. You can submit them, yes, to me, Jeff and I, on one of these slides. We've got our contact information on there. Please feel free to contact me if it's something that I can't address, a land use item. I'll forward it on to the town planner, the assistant manager, the manager. So certainly use Jeff and I as contact points for not only this evening's questions, but any other questions you may have. Absolutely. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and then jump into the second agenda item. And again, as it relates to kind of financing and what staff's projections are with the town center, consistent with the June 10th presentation, this will be about the first half of the presentation. So typically with any developments, town board asks town staff to do a financial projection. That's just one of many criteria which the board uses to evaluate a potential development project. So we did this obviously with this particular project. And these were some of the estimates we did back in March. And as Ranch Capital continues their presentation to the board and citizens have responses back, and their plan is going to change from what we projected in March. Generally, these projections may change, but they're not going to be materially different from what you see in front of you here. So again, it was an early projection, but generally these projections should hold with the particular development. So what we'd like to go through first are what we call one-time revenues associated with this particular development. One of the big beneficiaries of this particular development is the town's utility operation. And that's what's noted up there on the screen, known as Superior Metro District number 1. Anytime any new facility, residential, non-residential, connects to our utility system, they're essentially buying into our utility system. They're buying a small portion of the water plant, a small portion of the sewer plant. They're buying into our water portfolio, and there's a one-time charge associated with that we call connections or tap fees. So what we are projecting with this particular project, with collectively at build-out, tap fees in excess of $38 million. Another one-time revenue, and this has been the topic of quite a bit of conversation over the last several meetings with the board and planning commission, is positive impact to the schools. So we were looking at anywhere between $2 to $3 million with either a direct school impact fee or a land dedication in lieu of an impact fee. So we have that identified in the town code, and there's a one-time payment to the town as it affects to the school district. And then we use that money in conjunction with the school district. Over the years at the K-6 and K-8 schools and towns, we've done traffic improvements, parking lots, new trail connections, things of that nature. So we work with the school district on what their particular needs are. So those are the primary revenue sources, and there are many others, but we're trying to keep this kind of big picture. What will we do with those particular revenue sources? As I said, the primary beneficiary of a development of this scope and size financially will be the utility operation. Right now, and you may have heard this in some of the developers' previous presentations, and they're spot on, that right now the utility operation is not self-sufficient. What you want with a utility operation is your rates, fees, and charges, essentially your monthly bill that you pay the town superior. That should cover all your utility expenses. And right now we're in a situation where it covers the operating expenses, but we've got a big debt load outstanding. You see up there, $25 million in debt. Annual debt service payment of about $2.3 million. A big chunk of that is not covered by the utilities. Generally what happened is when we built our utility plants and acquired our water portfolio, and these are investments collectively over $100 million, debt was issued. And debt was issued essentially to build the plants by the portfolio that would meet our long-term needs instead of building incrementally. So as such, we built the entire utility operation, and then we've been saddled with this particular debt load. So what is happening practically on an annual basis is to service this debt, there's money being transferred from our general governmental operations, property tax, sales tax, to the tune of about $1.5 million a year to assist the utility operation. So if in fact debt is paid off, and we'll get into this in a second, what the net effect of that is we will no longer have this $1.5 million transfer, and we can use those funds however the board elects to use within the general fund. It may be tax decreases, programs, it would be a myriad of options, but at the end of the day, I would argue it would be beneficial to citizens within town, whatever those are. So we would look at paying off the debt. We also have a large capital project in the works that we will probably begin design on in 2016 and construction, or 2014 and construction in 2016. It's essentially our contribution in a big water storage facility, Windy Gap. This is the one that's immediately adjacent to Carter Reservoir outside of Berthoud. So it's a new water storage facility. It's roughly a $250 million project that 12 entities are participating in. Our participation is about $15 million. We have most of that in the bank, about 2/3, but we're still missing about $6 million for that particular project. So again, another use of those particular funds. And then finally, what would remain out of that $38 million in tap fees is our ability to fund some longer-term maintenance projects that we currently don't have funding for. We're getting some guidance from the federal government as well as the state government as it relates to heightened nutrient standards as it relates to our wastewater discharge. Those type of expenses for a water treatment plant our size are in the order of magnitude of $10 to $15 million that are time frame out, 10 years out-ish. But at this point in time, we don't have that funded. And absent a big infusion of cash like this, the only realistic funding source would be some higher than inflationary rate increases for your monthly water and sewer bill, but we'll get into that in a second as well. So the net result, I guess the takeaway of all this is, if in fact these one-time revenues come in, we use the one-time revenues as identified on the screen. It helps us with some pretty sizable utility rate increases, as well as the general fund being able to retain $1.5 million a year that is not transferred to the utility operation that can be used internally in the general fund, however it's to be determined. What do we have here? Now we have annual revenue. So agenda item number 3, kind of sources and uses of annual revenue. So what do we have here first? So we have some projections, and I know I've answered a number of individual questions, and a number of these have come up as it relates to, with the new development itself, what is that going to bring to the town financially? The first slice of that particular pie is we estimate about $1 million a year at build-out. And we're using today's dollars, 2013 dollars, so we don't argue about inflation factors or anything like that, but constant dollars at build-out of about $1 million a year. And you'll see parenthetically there's some reference to Louisville revenue sharing, don't really know what that is. On part of the property across the street, and about half of it, there's a long-standing agreement with the city of Louisville that we will share sales tax revenues with them. I would say maybe we don't want to get into it this evening, but we can clarify later what the history of that is. But essentially they get roughly half of the sales tax revenue that comes off that particular property. So factoring that in, working with the development team and their vision of what type of retail that is going to go in. As most of you know, along the corridor here, most of the big boxes have been spoken for. We've got probably enough big box retail here. So the retail we would be looking at generally would be unique maybe entertainment theme, but unique retail in this particular corridor that wouldn't really be competing with the Costco's and the Targets of the world. Having said that, and I know these questions have come up, so I'm going to go into a little level of detail here. What we're projecting revenue-wise is usually when we do our projection, we project revenue on a basis of how much is going to be generated on a square foot basis. So currently in the marketplace, and I'm going to factor out Costco because it really skews the numbers, but all the other shops collectively in the marketplace generate about $200 a square foot in revenues, and then we derive sales tax revenues from that. What we are projecting across the way, and again, we're thinking it's going to be unique retail, there's not going to be a lot of competition or cannibalization with existing retail, but we try to be conservative with our revenue estimates. So what we're projecting is sales on the basis of $100 a square foot. So again, trying to be reasonable with that particular approach. So we're going to have additional sales within the marketplace or within the town center. Then we're going to have new residents within the town center that spend money elsewhere as well. So we've got a question.
Quick question. Is your $200 a foot assumption for marketplace based on occupied or total square feet?
So the question was the $200 per square foot assumption at the Superior Marketplace. This is the Costco Target area. Is that based on total square footage or occupied square footage, and that is based on total square footage. And why that's important is, as you know, there are a number of inline retail over there that are not generating sales tax revenues. So again, we're making the assumption that there are going to be some uses there are some uses in the marketplace that are in retail space that aren't generating retail revenues, but I think that helps speak to the conservancy of this particular model as well. So again, that first $1 million is at build-out, kind of general revenues to the town. Yes, another question?
When is build-out? Your assumption?
And
Many years?
the assumption, and Randy can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're looking roughly in a frame of 7 to 10 years.
But what you used in your financials, what did you use?
7 to 10 years.
Oh, okay.
Is that correct, Randy? Randy says yes. Then in addition to this general sales tax revenue, we've got 3 specific sales tax revenues in the town that are dedicated for unique purposes. One's open space, one's capital improvements. I didn't even put the third one down, but it's for our interchange district that generates about $80,000 to $90,000 a year. So those, again, are new revenue generation sources. We've talked about this utility transfer. So again, what happens at the end of the year, Jeff will look at the books, identify what we need to support the utility operation. The average transfer between 2006 and 2012 is roughly $1.55 million. So we're assuming that once the utility debt is paid off, that transfer will not need to happen, and those funds can stay in the general fund and be used for whatever purpose the board elects to use those for. Yes, a couple questions.
They're from property taxes, the $1.5 million of the general fund?
So the question is, the $1.5 million, are they from property taxes? A small portion is from property tax. We commingle our general fund revenues. Property taxes are less than 10% of the town's revenue. The vast majority of this would be sales and what we call use tax. Tax on construction materials, tax on vehicles.
How much of that is sales tax of the $1.5 million?
Of the $1.5 million, it'll be roughly 60% sales tax and another 10 to 15% use tax, which is sales tax in my mind. Yes, one more question.
What is the final maturity of the debt from utilities?
The final maturity, the question was final debt for the maturity for the utilities is 2028. And that particular debt schedule actually has a rising payments. Currently it's $2.2 million. When it gets closer to maturity, it's about $2.6 million a year. Question?
How much square footage of retail are you assuming for that $1 million?
So question from City of Louisville is how much square footage is being assumed in the retail build-out, and our modeling is 280,000 square feet. Why that's important, when the City of Louisville brings that up, is the revenue agreement, share agreement calls for a minimum of 250,000 square feet of retail.
Does that 280,000 square feet include the retail that currently exists
So the question is,
on that side?
does the 280,000 of retail include the retail that currently exists over on that side?
Like old Chicago?
So, like in Old Chicago, the answer is no. The only retail that arguably exists over in that area, Old Chicago, Superior Liquors, is outside this particular area. There are some modicum, some very immaterial retail generating sales happening at the current temporary ICE facility, and that's the only retail that currently exists. A couple more questions.
The SMD1 debt that you said that you're going to pay off, is there a prepayment penalty?
So,
Pay home payment?
very good question. Is there a prepayment penalty on the SMD1 debt? So there is if we pay it off before December of 2016. Beginning 2016, thereafter, prepayment at par value. So we wouldn't anticipate utilizing that until we could pay it off at par.
How is that SMD1 debt secured?
Question is, how is that SMD1 debt secured? There are a couple of revenue sources. It's secured with your monthly rate fees and charges. It's secured by these tap fee revenue that we talked about, these one-time connection fees to the utility operation. And then there's a separate revenue share agreement with the town of Superior where this sales and use tax transfer also secures that particular debt. So it's a utility operation revenue, one-time and ongoing, and then the sales and use tax transfer from the general fund.
No general obligation bonds, no property tax.
So the question is, no general obligation bonds, no property tax. And when I think the reference of a general obligation bond is exactly that as it relates to property tax. So some sort of mill levy or tax can be assessed against properties that are covered by the district. That is correct. There is no GO, no property tax pledged to those particular bonds. One more question.
The SMD1 debt, was that, can you tell me, was that sold privately or publicly, and who holds it?
So the question is, SMD1 debt, was it sold privately or publicly? It's, I guess I'm not sure how to answer that. We went through a standard process, a competitive process, where we identified a debt underwriter. They helped us sell the debt in the regular debt market. So I guess I would say publicly. I mean, people who have purchased this debt would typically, it depends, but this is both state and federal tax exempt debt, so it's traditional government bonded type of debt.
But it's not a private bank, one holder of the debt.
So the question is, it's not a private bank or one holder of the debt, otherwise known as a private placement with the bank. It is not that. You could, if you would like to, you could go to your municipal securities advisor and purchase some of this particular debt.
I can get you a list of the holders if you like.
I think I can get that as well. Thank you.
So if, so we do these 3 districts and we issue the debt, and the town has its projections and they're awesome. Can't wait to have that happen. In the event that it doesn't, what happens to repaying the bonds?
So we're getting a little bit off task. If I understand the question is there's something referenced to 3 districts issuing debt, and if that debt payment doesn't happen, what is the exposure to the town? I think the question has to do with the creation of up to 3 metropolitan districts to do other things within that particular development. So I appreciate that as a concern, but that really doesn't come into play here. Ultimately, what the infrastructure financing, and this is the latter part of the presentation, so maybe we'll roll through it when we get to the latter part of the presentation. The public infrastructure financing, and when I use those gobbledygook governmental terms, that means building stuff that'll be dedicated to the town, roads, water lines, sewer lines, maybe a public garage. These are the large expenses that we're talking about, potentially up to $200 million. Those are going to be funded with, we'll talk about this in a minute, this tax increment financing, as well as there are going to be metro districts that are going to be established that are going to tax and tax only the property owners within the particular district to pay back that particular debt. It's very analogous for those of you who actually live in town or are property owners in town, and see on your property tax bill, there's going to be a reference to something like an SMD2 or Superior Metropolitan District 3 debt. About 6% of your property tax bill goes to those particular metro districts for the exact same purpose that we're talking about across the street. So years ago, SMD2, SMD3 were created to help fund a lot of the roadways, a lot of the parks, a lot of the trails within Superior. And you as property owners are paying off that debt. So a very similar analogy. Similar to Districts 2 and 3, and similar to potentially these new 3 districts created across the road, they are separate standalone financial districts. The town has no obligation whatsoever, on the hook whatsoever from a general obligation standpoint, from some sales tax transfers, no obligation for that particular debt. These are separate legal entities within the state of Colorado and operate financially as separate legal entities. One more question.
Original town got screwed by Rock Creek's districts and got included in that. Now, how are you going to prevent from Rock Creek, original town, Sagamore, getting screwed on down the road and being included in these new districts that you're going to create?
So the question was, original town was perhaps disadvantaged by the
Not disadvantaged, downright screwed. I want that heard on the TV.
by Metro District, I'm not sure by what Metro District, by Metro District 1, 2, or 3. I'm not sure how, speaking specifically to Metro District 1, which is again our utility operation, there's no what's known as GO or property tax support for that particular district. In fact, what happened is there were some issues with water and wastewater provision within original town, which was with impetus to potentially build some new water and wastewater facilities to service original town. And as such, original town residents pay those monthly water and sewer bills.
We paid our money to Louisville for sewer.
So the question was pay money to Louisville for sewer. Actually, the sewer payments come to the town of Superior, but the original town residents are benefited in that they pay a lower sewer rate than other residential customers in town. They pay to the town Louisville sewer rates, where the rest pay a higher sewer rate, and that's just an agreement that the town board has agreed to. So same, if not lower, monthly rates on the utility side. Original town residents, so then we have discussion if we have these other current metropolitan districts 2 and 3. And those districts have some outstanding debt, and like I say, about 6% of your property tax bill is paying that outstanding debt, but that doesn't apply to any of the properties within original town. So that's about all I can respond there, and perhaps Gladys, we can talk offline if I'm missing your
You're
point
not
there.
answering the rest of my question. How are you going to prevent present-day Rock Creek, Sagamore being included in these new districts that you're creating?
So the question is how to prevent the current town property owners or residents from being included within the new districts. The new districts will have very definitive boundaries, and their boundaries will be only the properties within the Superior Town Center development. And as such, only those properties can be subject to the new district rates, fees, and charges, or property taxes. Shall we move on, Jeff? And please continue. We can certainly use this forum, so please continue to ask questions. New connectors to the utility system not only pay one-time revenue, but they're going to pay ongoing fees. So that's net $600,000 a year to the utility operation to help continue to financially support that operation. We have miscellaneous revenues, annual revenues of about $480,000. A lot of those come from vehicle revenues. It'll be either gas taxes or what are known as specific ownership tax, which is essentially property tax on your vehicle, and your vehicle use tax when you buy a new vehicle. Questions?
Will there be any rec center type fees or civic space fees or structured parking or native parking on the street fees available to the town?
So the
districts.
So the question was, are there going to be any new recreation fees, facility fees, parking structure fees, on-street parking fees? And that's going to be determined. And we'll get into this in a moment, but there's quite a bit of questions focusing or revolving around civic space. And in a number of these agreements, we've identified that the developer will essentially, or the districts will issue up to $10 million in debt then to be effectively given to the town to build civic space. The town is yet to determine what they want to build, if it's going to be active playing fields, passive playing fields, full-service recreation center, town hall, meeting space. That process, like any capital process within town, will have quite a bit of dialogue in town. So once it's determined what those facilities will be, then also the determination will be, how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for the maintenance, and is that going to include an incremental charge? So I'm sorry to be nebulous, but it's too early to tell what additional fees there will be associated with these new facilities, if any.
But there's been much discussion and confirmation, if you will, of parking structures. And there is on-street parking, and there's a reference to Pearl Street or downtown Boulder, where there is metered parking and parking fees in the structures. Have you considered that in any of your revenue projections?
So question is, there's been dialogue about parking structured, on-street parking, and perhaps similar to Boulder. Boulder charges fees for that. Has there been any dialogue as it relates to if, in fact, maybe some of those fees will apply to these particular structures? We've had dialogue about it, yes, but again, no determination has been made. Okay. Yes, question?
Just wondered, how much utility user fees do we get today out of Superior? I'm just trying to get a relationship of the size today versus what's going to come from the STC.
So the question is, how much, specific to utility fees, that 600,000, how does that compare to the current volume of utility fees that we have? Give me 2 seconds, I got a perfect bar chart that will show you exactly existing revenue for all these revenue sources and what the new revenue looks like. So if you can bear with me, I think we'll answer that in about a couple slides, and maybe more in a second.
So if I could, Paul, I'm sorry, just to go back to the retail, you said 280-some thousand square feet of retail. How much of that, and maybe you answered this, I got here later and I apologize, but how much of that includes the building in which Boulder Valley Ice will be housed?
So the question was relating specific to the projected retail space in the town center, 280,000 that I mentioned, and if in fact, if any of that, how does the Superior Ice facility play into that particular number? The answer to that is 0. We've got that 120,000, I'm not sure what the exact number is, but we have the ice facility scheduled differently under a recreation facility. So the 280,000 does not include the Boulder Valley Ice facility.
Okay, and then, so, I'm sorry.
Would it include Cornerstone?
So the question is, would it include Cornerstone? No, we categorize the type of uses there differently. So just as a general categorization of space over there, we're looking at the retail that we talked about. Specific to the Cornerstone question, that would be categorized as office space. And then we have some flex space, some indoor rec space, that's the Boulder Valley Ice facility, some civic space, and hospitality space, which is the hotel. So as a follow-up question,
Yeah,
James?
so if I could, just, we understand there's the potential for 280,000 square feet, but much, in fact, all but 80,000 square feet, to my understanding, based on the plan as it stands today, or stood when I looked at it last week, was that there was 80,000 square feet of dedicated retail. And so, in deference to our friends in Louisville who are expecting 250,000 square feet of retail, if we had 80,000 square feet dedicated and 200,000 square feet of potential yet flex space, what's driving whether or not it becomes retail? Because to listen to the developer talk, they're going to build what works for them. And maybe, given my understanding of the real estate market today, commercial space is not the thing that is saleable necessarily immediately. And I'm all in favor of not having dark commercial structures, but I'm also not in favor of having a bunch of dedicated residential structures that then have to be repurposed at great expense and usually less than stellar outcomes for commercial. And so what is it that helps Louisville make sure that the agreement we made with them is upheld?
So I'm going to provide a quick synopsis of that. If in fact we've got a long question like that, could I maybe ask you to speak that into the mic, but so I don't misstate what was asked, but generally what was stated or asked was.
Are you doing that for television? Because I think people here couldn't hear me.
That is correct. So if those of you who arrived late, again, we've got printouts outside. Why I'm unfortunately talking in the mic is we are doing this for television, so it's being webcast now.
I apologize. I would have
It's on and Channel 8 now, no problems. And it'll be available for viewing. So that's why we're doing it in a more formal setting. So a quick synopsis of the question
So the question is,
I think I've got it.
Yeah, good.
Quick synopsis of the question is, plans that have been proposed show 80,000 of designated retail space. The difference between that and the 280 that I referenced, the other 200,000 maybe is not definitively identified. Concerns about that, concerns about meeting our obligation with our intergovernmental agreement with Louisville. And all I can tell you is the developer is aware of that, the board is aware of that, staff is aware of that, and we are confident we'll meet our commitment with that particular IGA.
Okay.
So, question?
Can we just keep going?
I would, so one comment from the audience was to keep going on this, and that would be my preference, again, just to try to make sure everybody has the same foundational elements because of different levels of understanding and of interest, frankly. So, I'm going to leave it all up to you, and I will keep going until I get questions, if that appears to be reasonable.
Yes.
But maybe could you just finish with Louisville's, the representative from Louisville's follow-up to this last bit of conversation we're having, and then we can cruise on.
Okay, so we have one more follow-up question from the audience.
Sorry, just a quick, so the assumption of $1 billion of sales tax to Superior, so is your assumption that based on your calculations that Louisville will also get $1 million annually by build-out based on the 50-50 split?
So the synopsis of the question was that new net revenue to the town, undesignated, at $1 million, and will Louisville get a like amount of that? And the answer to that is no. The new net revenue to the town comes from a couple of different sources. One is from sales within the Superior Town Center. And only roughly half of the acreage within Superior Town Center is Louisville eligible for reimbursement as part of the IGA. So it's only that 80 acres out of roughly the 155 acres that are eligible, so the retail in that particular area. That represents, the reimbursement to Louisville represents roughly $350,000 to $400,000 a year. In addition to that, as I mentioned earlier, we are anticipating that we're going to have new residents in town, and they are going to be shopping at not only the new retail that happens within the Superior Town Center, but they will help support our existing retail. So they're going to go over and shop at Costco and Panera and Target as well, and that's what will make up essentially the balance of the net new revenue of $1 million.
Okay, great.
So in total, collectively, we're talking about $3.9 million. There's just a fancy schmancy little pie chart for you. Next one is the bar chart that there was some interest in as it relates to the lower part of each bar. And a lot of these are takeaways, so I apologize. So if you can't even read it on your handout, you can get this on the web page. But generally what we're looking at are the half or dozen or so primary revenue sources. The hatched area at the bottom represents existing revenue, and the solid area at the top represents new revenues from those existing revenue sources. So just a different way to look at that, but those solid areas at the top collectively add up to $3.9 million, the same number.
So Paul, can you help us understand what the no general fund to utility transfer means?
So there was a question as it relates to the no general fund to utility transfer, and that amount on the bar you can see is probably exactly between $1 million and $2 million. So this again is the $1.5 million number we're talking about currently that comes from the general fund, again predominantly from sales and use tax, very little property tax, that supports the utility debt payments. If in fact we get one-time revenues as someone connects to the utility system, called system development fees, and that was the $38 million at the beginning of the presentation. As those fees come in, we pay off our debts. We don't prepay it in current penalty. We start paying off in 2016 or thereafter. And once that debt is paid off, that transfer no longer needs to happen, and that money continues to reside in the general fund. So that's the purpose of that little bar there.
Are your revenue assumptions about the town as it is Superior Marketplace, what are those assumptions over the build-out period?
So the question is, what are the assumptions as it relates specifically to the Superior Marketplace? Again, Costco, Target. Generally, we look at inflationary increases. Additionally, what we drill down in a little bit more higher level of detail, depending upon housing type, the Bureau of Labor Stats will estimate how much gross income a household needs to generate to purchase a home or purchase an attached unit. So we will look at those stats, and roughly the category is that if you need to buy a home, we assume that you fall in the Bureau of Labor Stat category of $100,000 a year. Bureau of Labor Stats then will break down type of purchase, what typically a $100,000 a year person will spend. And I'll use one example. So they will spend roughly 4% of their income on groceries. We capture that. That's a retail that retail entity in town that we have pretty good representation of. So we make the assumption there, for example, that we will capture of that 4%, roughly 80% of that with the grocery stores we have in town. So that's on top of the inflationary estimate we use. We will use those particular projections to assume incremental sales tax revenue as well. Onward, Jeffrey. So we talked about revenues. We'll talk briefly about expenses. In dialogue with Boulder County Sheriff, who provides law enforcement services for the town of Superior, they have always, over the years, identified that by the building of Superior Town Center, we would need to expand our current contract by 2 deputies. So we're estimating cost of $250,000 actual, and we've got the Boulder County Budget Director here, but I think actually our cost right now for 1 deputy is about $110,000. So again, we're trying to be a little bit conservative on some of these expense estimates.
So, but as we look at services from the sheriff's office, those 2 deputies wouldn't be dedicated to the Superior Town Center, right? They'd just be deputies at large who also are now responsible for taking calls in Superior, and so cover the basically 450-ish square miles that Boulder County comprises?
Question, would these 2 deputies be exclusively dedicated to the Superior Town Center? No, but they would be exclusively dedicated to the town of Superior. Our contract is very specific with Boulder County Sheriff's Department, is the deputies we pay for generally stay within town. Obviously, if there's a large incident that they need to go out of town, they will. Conversely, if we have a large incident within town, Boulder County will send additional sheriffs within there to town to cover. But these deputies stay within town. We're also looking at 3 field maintenance staff members, and again, not knowing the scope of what we talk about as civic space, but we're estimating that we're going to have some additional turf to take care of, some additional water lines, sewer lines to maintain, street lane miles to maintain. We think that estimate is high, but maybe 3 bodies in the field to help out with that. We contract out for our snow removal expenses and our street maintenance expenses, and these are routine street maintenance expenses, typically the crack sealing, pothole repair, so $50,000 for that. Most of our grounds maintenance in town is handled through a contract, so this is assuming not only might we not only in addition to adding additional staff member here at town, but we have factored in additional grounds maintenance with our current contractor, as well as ancillary expenses, chemical application, water, things of that nature. Again, town facility maintenance, we don't know what, if any, new town facilities are going to be, but between playing fields, community space, libraries, town hall, there may be some additional space. So we just wanted to put a line in there for some incremental maintenance. Ultimately, the plan is one of the plans is if in fact a new town hall is built, these buildings would be in all likelihood sold, so the town would no longer have maintenance expenses associated with them. And just a general line to put in for capital renewal and replacement line, whatever that may be. I mean, ultimately, we're going to need to, replace roads and do major rehabilitations on turf, if in fact that was one of the public amenities added. So it's essentially establishing a capital sinking fund for future maintenance expenses for a total of $1 million. Are these numbers exact? Are the revenues numbers exact? No. I think the intent here is to, try to get a general order of magnitude and generally try to, within some level of reasonableness, identify that from a fiscal standpoint, the revenues outweigh the expenses by a factor of 4 to 1. If you don't agree with these numbers, maybe expenses are $2 million a year, then it's a factor of 2 to 1. Revenues exceed expenses.
So, Paul, the thing that I'm really having trouble reconciling, right, is there's this potential, call it somewhere between $80 million and $200 million in bond placements, right? Those will be real. Everything that we're talking about now, including these expense projections, are just that, projections. So we have the real and then the projected. And my concern is when the projected doesn't meet the real, what happens? When we don't get to 250,000 square feet of retail, and we don't meet our obligation to Louisville. Not saying we won't, but right now, we're not even guaranteed 80,000 square feet of retail. It's not guaranteed. It's planned, but it's not guaranteed. So we talk about one-time revenues, and I get it. If we build the whole thing, there will be tap fees. But on the other hand, if we don't do the commercial, and we don't get the sales tax, and we don't get the coverage for these bonds that are placed, what happens? That's the thing I don't understand. I sat with Matt Madley, and I heard him say, and I'm hoping that the folks on TV can hear me because I have a big mouth. So I sat with Matt, and he said, there won't be any obligation to the citizens of the town outside of whatever these areas are.
James, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt. This is the second half of the presentation.
Okay, then I'll just listen. Thanks.
Great, awesome. So again, maybe if we can try to drill through this, kind of do it quickly, it may answer a number of these questions, but we're open to whatever format you'd like to use. Question?
I have a question on electricity costs and irrigation water costs for the town center.
Okay.
Are they in here somewhere?
So a question as it relates to the ongoing expense specific to electricity cost and water cost. My assumption
electricity costs are going to be associated with, streetlight maintenance and with, any new facilities. And then as it relates to water costs, yes, generally it's in there. So for example, under that $250,000 ground maintenance expense, I assumed $150,000 additional contract expense with our current contractor Vargas and an additional $50,000 for water. As a point of comparison, Town 9 Park recently renamed Founders Park. When I say Town 9, it's approximately 9 acres. Last year's water bill on that particular park was $7,000. So, extrapolating that out for 30 or 40 or 50 acres, that $50,000, for example, appears to be hopefully reasonable. So, yes, was answered. Long-winded, answer to your question. Electricity costs, arguably included in any of those lines. And there's electricity associated with grounds maintenance. So it's included there. Electricity associated with town facilities. Electricity associated with street maintenance. So embedded intuitively within all three of those lines.
The streetlights, would they be part of the districts, metro districts?
It depends on what level of public infrastructure, but typically if you have a public road, and most of these will be public roads, not all, and you have a street light associated with that road, when the road is dedicated to the town, the ancillary facilities, including the street lighting, will come to the town as well.
Thank you. Just quickly, where's the road maintenance within the town center at cost?
So the question is, Jeff, you can go back a couple slides. The road maintenance within that cost within the town, where we have annual maintenance of $50,000 a year. Currently, we have a contract, so order of magnitude, we have a contract for a third party to provide snow plowing essentially to all residential streets, depending upon what level of snow removal. But between that snow contract and our materials contract, it's roughly $275,000 a year. I don't think we're on a proportional level or be adding anywhere near the lane miles to get up to 50,000, but we have 50,000 there. Then as it relates, next slide please, to ongoing replacement, we're doing the pretty extensive road repair work this year around the Purple Park area. That's generally what that 250 gets to, is kind of the ongoing capital maintenance associated with some of those infrastructure items, road maintenance being one of the primary factors there. Question?
On the adding 2 deputies, how do they determine that? Do they factor in that it's high-density residential? Is that more conducive to higher crime rates? Or how do they determine what we need as far as security for this, adding this new town center and the high-density residential?
So the question was specific to the addition of 2 new deputies, and have we taken into account generally that there's going to be some attached housing, high-density housing, and as the staffing level reflected that. So in our discussions with the Sheriff Pelley and his command staff, they know what type of development we're talking about here, and they have come back and said they are comfortable with those staffing levels based on the type of residential that's being added, with the rec facilities, with the hospitality, they feel comfortable with that 2 FTE. I don't intend to speak for Sheriff Pelley, because he can speak for himself much better than I can, but I'm quite confident they understand and realize that and factor that into their staffing projections. So very quickly, and this is kind of the last agenda item, number 4, but the last part of the presentation that briefly was presented in the town on June 10th. What happens without Superior Town Center development? So that's essentially our current budget that we are working under this year. We've projected a 5-year plan, operating capital plan. What we've been able to do town-wide, the town controls 4 different property taxes. And I won't go into detail what they are, but since 2004, every year since 2004, the town has reduced our property tax rate. If you look at many of the other taxing entities you'll see on your tax bill, I'm not sure very many of them can say that. Our portion of the tax bill is small comparatively, but we've been able to decrease over the last decade between these 4 taxing entities the tax rate. There's some question of whether we're going to continue to be able to do that, that we are starting to realize some stress in our budgets. You can go online, you can talk to Jeff and I about it, but essentially at the end of the 5 years between that large utility project to build that new reservoir with an aggressive street maintenance program that we have, our capital reserves are essentially at 0. So it's going to put stress on the ability to continue to lower property tax rates, just to be honest. I can say with a fair amount of confidence utility rates will increase. For a historical perspective, we've actually been pretty aggressive. Over the last several years, we've had to increase our utility rates. And again, recognize that we're increasing our utility rates, and we're still $1.5 million a year away from being self-sufficient of maybe a total of $4 million in utility revenues. We have to then throw another $1.5 million on top, or another, whatever that is, 40% or so. So we've been aggressive since 2009. Water rates have increased 4 to 5% annually. They're planning to continue to increase at a clip of 5% a year through our 5-year planning horizon and currently in the budget. And thereafter, because of some of these federally and state mandated standards being placed on us with our treatment plants, they're going to increase at least at those levels, if not more, into the future. Same sort of thing on the water side. Here we've been looking at every other year 5% increases since 2007. Those are going to go up 5% a year now for the foreseeable future. And this is the utility operation which really is having the unfunded federal mandates placed upon it. So I guess that's a fancy way of saying maybe even higher utility rates. And again, this is not a scare tactic. This is what we've been planning all along. Jeff and I, we are counsels to the manager, counsels to the board, and we try to be as reasonable as we can as it relates to this, and that's just a practical reality here.
So, Paul, if I could, just so it's clear, there's no guarantee that if the Superior Town Center develops, those increases won't happen, because, again, we have no guarantee that the projected anything from the Superior Town Center is going to happen. So we can bring in the houses and we can bring in the whatever, but if we don't bring in the retail that actually provides revenue dollars, there's no guarantee that that changes under the Superior Town Center. Am I correct?
There's not a 100% guarantee. You're absolutely correct. There's probably a 99.5% guarantee that is going to happen. And really where that happens is when someone connects to the utility system. That is the point in time when they pull their building permit and they pay their building permit fees. That's when they pay their system development fee. That's before anything is built. That's when they build their permit. So that's that $38 million part of the equation. So if people are paying their connection fees and building their buildings, and in 1 year, 5 years, 7 years, they are successful, they aren't successful, we've captured that tap fee revenue, and that's helping to offset the debt service payments.
So when the Calamonte development was approved, they paid all their tap fees up front, right?
So again, when someone connects to the utility system, so when either a house connects or in this case of this Calamonte development, and again, this is the development on the southeast corner, southeast of McCaslin and Colton, when they connected the system for their 5 units, they would pay the connection fee for those 5 units.
But didn't and probably won't.
When
That's
those,
all I'm saying. There is no guarantee. Well, see, so, because, I mean, Calamonte was sold as this wonderful thing for that corner, and geez, what they said the market wanted isn't, and so that project's not happening. And I just want to make it clear that we can look at this, and it's true, but I'm just wondering if half-built and empty is better, half-built, empty, and with continued increases in fees and taxes, is better than not built and waiting for the right thing to happen. That's all I'm just saying there is no guarantee that what you're projecting is going to happen. So I'm going to harp on that for as long as I'm here, but luckily for you, I only have 4 more minutes.
so just as a point of clarification, the 10 units that are out there connected to the utility system and paid the fees associated with that.
But the rest of the 10 buildings that they expected, or 8 buildings that they expected, hadn't happened and don't plan to happen anytime soon.
So the question was that the remaining buildings haven't happened and don't plan to happen anytime soon. They obviously haven't happened. We are in serious dialogue with a builder who in all likelihood is going to start up very, very soon with that. We have been working with the FDIC to get the closure on that particular property, and that's happened if it's not going to be happening already. What do we got here? So again, what this assumes is also what our budget always assumes, and we always tell the board this, is we continue budgeting, assume we have no major loss of existing retail. And again, why that's important, and the question arose earlier of, how much of this transfer from the general fund goes over the utility operation. I just want to make the point that most of the town operations are funded by this magical thing called sales and use tax. You buy your loaf of bread and you pay to the town your 3% tax. That's what funds most of our operations. In addition to that, not only does it fund most of our operations, but most of the tax in the town of Superior comes from a very focused number of stores. So 2 of the stores, and you can probably guess which 2 those are, generate 60% of that revenue town-wide. The top 5 retailers in town generate 3/4 of the town revenue. We're lucky we have some quality retailers that have some good sales tax numbers, but you see maybe not every day, but you see frequently large retailers closing up shop. And if that would happen with one of these particular stores, it would have a dramatic impact town-wide. So just kind of want to make that point that we're assuming those will continue. So I guess the takeaway on that, if we have lack of revenue diversification, potentially this development would augment or enhance revenue diversification by either more people shopping at those stores or more stores coming into town to diversify where our revenue stream comes from. As I mentioned already, our current capital plan talks about spend down of all our capital programs within the 5-year period of time. Under utility bills, some are more in tune to this than others, but there's a $30, what's known as a landscape maintenance fee for some enhanced landscaping within town. And we assume that when we took over the districts 2 and 3 in 2004, the town has been able to maintain that landscape fee. There's been some dialogue annually throughout the budget process of, hey, can we reduce that fee? Can we eliminate that fee? And we would like nothing more than to do that, but we can't with the current budget cycle, the current budget foundation that we have, and into the future, if in fact, into the future, absent any material new developments, that fee is going to do nothing but stay at 30 or perhaps even go up on a monthly basis. So takeaway on this, I had noted, without potentially new revenues associated with development. Depending upon what scenario that we have, if we have, in fact, the need to fund a major rehab of our wastewater treatment plant, depending upon how we elect to fund it, we may be looking at going to the citizens and requesting a ballot issue to increase sales tax or property tax. That's just the reality. It's not a scare tactic. Question?
Question on the takeaway. It makes it seem as though there's going to be plenty of new STC revenues to do things such as new capital, but if you have in your best, you have 4 million new revenue, 1 million annual expenses, you haven't yet said what the debt service expense is going to be, and 145 million, it's not going to be small. What's the actual bottom line to the town?
So, question again relating to a perception that there's going to be a new debt service expense associated, new debt service expense to the town or the town citizens associated with this particular development.
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, so that wasn't it. I apologize.
I'm sorry.
Would you like? Oh, go ahead.
I'm happy.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. The proposal I read said there could be as much as 145 million of bonds. Is that correct?
That is correct, but we'll get into that in a minute. That gets into this issue of this urban renewal authority and tax
So
increment
is that a different
financing.
revenue source than all the ones you just went through?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Question?
Could you, I know it's hard, but could you put ballpark per household kind of number on what kind of, in the worst case scenario, what are we looking at in terms of revenue shortfall or need to be made up?
Question, ballpark, put on each individual household if in fact we're looking at some of these revenue shortfalls and need to increase revenues. I can quantify the utility rate increases. Each 1% utility increase will increase your, so the average monthly bill is about $100 townwide. 1% utility increase will increase your average monthly bill by 60 cents. Doesn't sound like a lot, but if you start to aggregate and accumulate 5% over a number of years, it in fact adds up. If we've done some initial projections as it relates to if in fact we needed to fund $10 to $15 million in improvements in a wastewater facility, what we had noted up there is over the next 5 years a 5% rate increase. Thereafter, it would take something like a 25% rate increase annually for a period of 3 to 5 years to over 4,000 people who live here in town to pay for something like that. So maybe there's some ballpark figures if that helps.
Yep, thank you.
You're welcome. Jeff, next item, please. All right, so now we're getting on to agenda item 5. This is the new stuff. That was the old stuff. Now this is the new stuff. So there's been some talk about something called urban renewal authorities or superior urban renewal authorities. So why we're bringing this up is this is a mechanism we're using to assist with the redevelopment of the property and the payment of public infrastructure. So we have something in the state of Colorado which is used extensively, throughout the state. It's called an urban renewal authority. And the intent of urban renewal authorities, can see up there, is to create or is to prevent and eliminate slums and blighted conditions. In this case, we would call this a blighted condition. So what we have, and we'll get into this in a minute, we did this 20 years ago with Superior Marketplace, and it worked very successfully there. We've extended the boundaries of Superior Marketplace of the Superior Urban Renewal Authority to include the Superior Town Center, where we're going to do the exact same thing. To the second bullet down there, we've identified in 2004 across the street that this was a blighted condition. We did a blight study. The state statutes are very specific in what constitutes a blight study. There are 11 or 12 factors. We reviewed it. The board at that point in time, in 2006, elected to say, yes, the area across the street is blighted. Let's extend the boundaries of the Urban Renewal Authority that at a point in time we can use some of the financing mechanisms of a URA, we'll get into that in a second, to help remove this blighted condition. What URAs can't do, third bullet down, is they have no ability to levy any new taxes, any new assessments, and we'll talk about how the money is generated, but they're an entity that can't levy any taxes. So the process is we need to adopt an urban renewal plan, and that's one of the documents that's going through the process right now. And I think currently, in August, we're looking at adopting what's called an urban renewal plan amendment. We have a current plan that covers the Superior Marketplace. We've extended the boundaries over to the Superior Town Center, and we're going to adopt a new plan to recognize that. This plan, we sent it to the school district as well as the county to provide them copies and review on this particular item as is required by state statute. It requires the Planning Commission to review this particular item. Planning Commission did this in May and unanimously approved the urban renewal plan. So if we can now, Jeff, drill in a couple more URA general items. So how do we use this urban renewal authority to create revenues to help unblight a property? And how that generally works is something called tax increment financing. You can do it on either sales and or property taxes. And the increment infers new. So it's by the creation, so we establish that there are some current property and sales taxes being generated by that particular area. What this whole concept of tax increment financing does is say we will capture any new property revenues and sales tax revenues and invest those revenues to eliminate the blighted conditions across the road. So we'll get into this in quite a bit more detail in just a minute. Once we do that, once we capture these incremental or new revenues, we invest it in the public infrastructure into the project area, and then we're done with that, then this all goes away. So typically there's a 25-year time limit on capturing these particular monies, investing them in the project area, and then they will revert back to the original taxing authorities. So we talked about urban renewals in general. We have an urban renewal authority. It's Superior at the beginning of all those words. Created in 95, it did the exact same thing that we're proposing all across the street. It funded public improvements in the Superior Marketplace. And that will run through 2019. And this one, though, is exclusively in a sales tax increment district. So what we're doing is we're capturing the incremental sales tax revenues and paying back for those particular public improvements. And as I mentioned, the boundary areas were expanded by the board in 2006 to include the area east of McCaslin, the Superior Town Center. So again, it's been the vision of many different boards over the past decade to utilize urban renewal authority powers and tax increment financing to assist with the development. And just as an informational item for you, we have this urban renewal authority. Essentially, our town board sits as the commissioners of the urban renewal authority. So it's the same individuals you see behind the dais each Monday night. Question?
Is Louisville connected in any way with this SURA?
The question is Louisville, assuming the city of Louisville, collected in any way with this SURA? And the answer is no. This is a separate authority that is under the auspices or the sitting members are, again, our board members. So, again, let's get into this tax increment financing. Again, utilizing tax increment is used to finance public improvements within urban renewal areas, taking the new property and or sales tax revenues and investing that to eliminate the blighted conditions. For the Superior Marketplace, $21 million in public improvements were identified, and we're funding repayment of those through the incremental sales tax revenues. Why would we want to use this TIF, these tax increment funds? It's identified that you use these and it can fund needed public improvements within your area without a tax increase. And again, what we're talking about is the new revenues, essentially the new revenues generated from new development. So a new home, a new business goes in a couple of years after it's built, there will be new property tax revenues generated, and that's what we're capturing and using to pay for the infrastructure associated with servicing that particular area. And again, a very common and recognized finance tool within the state of Colorado. Question?
Do you know how much TIF is being generated in the state of Colorado now?
Question was how much TIF is being generated within the state of Colorado. I do not know. The DOLA, or Department of Local Affairs, state agency, on their website has a summary, I'm not sure of all, but it has a pretty good summary of urban renewal authorities within the state of Colorado. And they then ask or require that these urban renewal authorities submit annual reports, and in those annual reports you can see what that particular remittance is. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure if it's one or if it's all, but City of Westminster, for example, who has multiple urban renewal authorities, are generating over $10 million a year in urban renewal authority revenue. But I think this DOLA website, if you want to drill down to that level of detail, would provide you that information. Question?
So do I understand correctly that the Superior Marketplace TIF was $21 million for what went on there, compared to this is going to be $145 million with much less retail space that will generate sales tax than what comes from there? And it's, how many times, more than 10, well, not quite 10 times, what that is. I mean, it's a lot of money.
So the question generally was comparing the $21 million that was currently identified as public improvements within the Superior Marketplace, the Costco area, comparing that to the $145 million, which is not that number, and we'll get into that in a second, that was proposed over in the Superior Town Center, and the ability of sales tax, incremental sales tax revenues to support that $145 million. So again, a few more slides, we'll be right in the middle of that particular dialogue. If I can defer, thank you very much. So again, we talked about where does this incremental or new revenue come from. So once the SURA project area is identified, the existing property tax revenue is identified, the existing sales tax revenue is identified, and those are called the base amounts. And then any new or incremental revenues above that is essentially the incremental amounts. The existing amounts continue to flow to the existing taxing entities, and actually we're going to get into this. Most of this is not about sales tax, it's about property tax. So most of the property tax, the existing property tax, will continue to flow to the Boulder counties of the world, the Boulder Valley School Districts, the Rocky Mountain Fire Authorities, Urban Drainage, Town Superior, all those overlay areas. And then any new revenues that are generated by new development will flow then exclusively to the Urban Renewal Authority. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the financing aspect of the urban renewal area and the collection of the TIF revenues goes out 25 years. So what do we have here? And again, these next couple are takeaways for you. I know it's a lot of small information here, but essentially what we're showing on the screen is, on the x-axis is time, so this would be like the 25-year clock, and on the y-axis is property values. So what we would do is we'd identify in year one, good thing I'm not a doctor, identify in year one that we have a base amount. We have some current property tax revenues, and that amount of property tax revenues will be established, and it will be constant and continue to flow to the existing taxing entities. And then as new development happens, we will have this rise or this increment of property tax revenues which will go to the Urban Renewal Authority. So this particular area here represents the new or incremental property tax revenues that come to the Urban Renewal Authority. Question?
What is the amount of the valuation currently?
The question is, what is the amount or the valuation currently of the, and my assumption is of the properties within the Superior Town Center. I don't know that answer, but generally it's relatively small. There are some of the parcels over there that are valued as agricultural land. But
2.1 million, I think, was in your documents.
so in the documents, there was a reference of $2.1 million. I'm sure if that's a document I put together, there's probably some backup to that. So let's say a couple $1 million. Question or comment?
Just commenting on the 2.1 million, identified the whole remaining area, I believe, in the Urban Renewal Authority, not the 157 acres that's subject to the Superior Town Center application. And I think the Superior Town Center application is closer to 400,
$140,000.
So there's a clarification, and again, this, as it relates to the $2.1 million that was identified as current valuation, and the comment was that that may include the ultimate entire envisioned area, the Superior Town Center of 180 acres. As it relates to this particular plan development or PD application, which includes only 155 of that 180 acres, the valuation may be smaller, closer to $400,000. But whatever the number is, that's what this horizontal line is to represent. That's not the property tax revenue, that's the valuation on which the property taxes are charged against. So like your home is market value of $500,000, the valuation that it's taxed on is roughly 8% of that particular number, or what would that be, $40,000. So that's what we're talking about, valuation, or what the taxes are imposed upon. Then we get increased valuation that generates additional tax revenues that is then captured by the Urban Renewal Authority. So another takeaway graphic, Jeff. Question before we go to this other one.
Quick question on the last slide there. Do you have any assumption, or are you assuming that there are no incentives having to be offered to any owner of that retail space to get them to come here?
So the question is included in, I guess, the revenue assumptions with new or incremental property tax revenues. Are there perhaps some incentives to entice a developer to entice a retailer to come in town, and would that maybe bias or that maybe change the revenue projections? Again, typically with a retailer, you're absolutely right that if in fact we would look at an incentive, it would be typically a sales tax incentive. But
So there's no property tax abatement or anything like that?
well, the question is there's no property tax abatement. We have one property it's specific to Boulder Valley Ice that we're looking at a abatement, but that has been factored into this equation.
So no further ones in this?
So the comment was no further, and that is correct. There are no further assumptions as it relates to that. So again, a different way to look at the same thing for those of you that are visual maybe in another way, but we've got a house that's generating some property tax revenue. So you pay your bill, or your mortgage company pays your bill, and that'll go to Boulder County. Boulder County will kindly, for a market, for an innocuous little fee, they will collect that and remit that to all the taxing entities, which is appropriate. So part of the money which Boulder County is collecting, it goes back to what we call the base amount, that horizontal line we saw on 2 graphs ago. That will continue to go back to the existing property tax entities. Then any new property tax generated goes to the Urban Renewal Authority, otherwise known as SURA. Then with the money within SURA, a big chunk of the money is planned to go back to pay for public improvements. And this starts to address some of the questions that we've heard as it relates to $145 million in public improvements or something of that nature. This money will help pay for that level of public improvements, for whatever public improvements. I do want to note, the gentleman who just made the last point, there's a small chunk of that particular money that we'll use to go to other incentive obligations. We have an incentive, $2 million incentive obligation with Boulder Valley Ice to assist them with building of their facility, and that's the property tax revenue. And we have a recognition that maybe roughly half of the mills or the property tax revenue going to the fire district may go back to them because there may be some additional service load on them as it relates to this particular development. The board will ultimately decide that, but even though these lines may look the same, a vast majority of the revenue is being generated and is called shared revenue. So now we'll start to talk about some of the terms that are in the agreements. Incremental property tax revenue to pay for these particular public improvements. So question?
Just a question clarification. This flow chart, the incremental property tax applies only to properties within the Superior Town Center, not current ones.
So the question is, this new incremental property tax revenue applies only to properties within the Superior Town Center area. That is correct. So this second plan amendment to the SURA plan, which the board will consider in August, identifies specifically the plan area where we will capture these tax increment revenues, and that is the Superior Town Center area, the property within that particular area. Question or comment?
Paul, before a metropolitan district is formed, is there a vote required of all property owners within that district?
So there was a question as it relates to metropolitan districts, and we'll get into this in a minute, but the question is, a metropolitan district, when it's formed, is there a requirement that property owners within that particular, those districts vote? And the answer is...
All three of them?
And the answer is yes. And another anecdotal comment, all three of them. So potentially, there are up to 3 metropolitan districts, and again, a separate legal entity that would be created, Superior Town Center. If and when these districts are formed and voted on, they will be the property owners within those particular districts, and only the property owners within those districts voting on the creation of those particular districts.
But right now, there are only a few property owners in that area, is what I was saying, not the 3 districts, but there's probably 3 property owners.
So the comment was there are probably only a few property owners within that area, and that answer would be correct. But that is correct. But again, very similar to when Districts 2 and Districts 3 were created in Rock Creek Ranch. When those were originally created, the property owners weren't the 4,000 property owners up there now. It was Richmond Homes and Richmond Homes only.
Paul, just sort of following up on that, if a bunch of neighbors were concerned about being drawn into a metropolitan district without notice or approval or authorization, if there's only 3 property owners that could vote for the formation of a metropolitan district in Superior Town Center, and there were 4 other homes, or 40, 500, whatever, any other homes other than those 3 property owners, if they're brought into a metropolitan district and there's a vote, would that metropolitan district be allowed to be formed if the majority of the property owners voted against it?
So a quick synopsis of the question: if in fact the majority of property owners elect not to create a metropolitan district or be included in the metropolitan district, would that vote prevail? And the answer is yes. If the majority of the vote is to not create a metropolitan district, that would prevail, and conversely, if the vote was to create a metropolitan district, that would prevail. But we'll get into metropolitan districts in just a minute, right after we go through this whole SURA-TIF thing.
Could you just quickly, if you took, $100 coming out of the homeowner there, how does that break down percentage-wise? How does that $100 get distributed in that flow?
So the question is, how would, for example, an example of how would $100 get broken down in the flow? Say it's $100 of tax base that is currently there. Someone's over there and they're paying $100 in tax base. That wasn't the question.
Well, that doesn't,
Okay.
it's incremental.
So how about if I use this analogy? We have a taxpayer over there that's paying $1 right now, and maybe they're, as it relates to growth on their particular property, new construction, that tax bill goes from $100 to $101, because that'll cover all aspects of this flow of funds, if you'll bear with me here. So say we have $101, $101 of base revenues and $100 of what are called incremental or new revenues. So $101 goes to the county. Coming back to us is something less than $101, but again, it's about $100. It's anywhere between 1% and 1.5% fee. But that $1 would go to the existing folks here. The other $100 would go to the urban renewal area. If in fact, this new $100 of revenue coming in has nothing to do with ICE, it's a different building, nothing to do with Boulder Valley ICE, what it would look like is maybe out of that $100, maybe $10 goes to the fire authority, and $90 goes to help repay for this public infrastructure that was installed. Did that help? Thank you. Yes, question?
Well, I want to thank you for you being so forthright in this conversation. It's refreshing to have you talk to us in this manner and give us the facts so that we're better educated. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, you're welcome. That was just a comment. Question? question is, within the Superior Town Center, is it assumed to have both sales tax TIF and property tax TIF? And the answer to that question is yes. The easiest answer to that is there is very little sales tax TIF, and the only sales tax TIF, or the new sales tax revenue, will be on the property outside of the area of the Louisville revenue share agreement. So it's essentially what we call the southern properties, the properties that are essentially immediately adjacent to the north part of Rock Creek Ranch, Waterford, that particular area. So only on a very small portion, arguably probably generating not a whole lot of revenue, will there be sales tax TIF revenues, and it will not be on the Louisville IGA portion of the property. What do we got next, Jeff? TIF. Oh, I'm sorry, we have a question? On the last flow chart, okay.
So in your example of the $1 that's being generated from the base level of the property taxes, you're saying that $1 is what currently goes to the school districts, which in this case is Boulder Valley, the county, the fire districts, all the special districts that are part of that mill levy that is being collected. Those groups will not enjoy any inflation over the 20 to 25 years of the TIF breakdown. So could you once more go through which groups are going to be mitigated for the effect of all these new people moving into town, and which groups are not going to receive any benefit from this? Because I heard you say you're anticipating some for the fire districts, and so I'm wondering about the other ones. School district, who's going to see enrollment go up, county, who's going to see services. I'm sorry, that was a long question.
That's quite all right, not nearly as long as some of the other questions. So the general question was, with the existing base property tax revenue that's coming in the scenario we're using the $1 out of the $101, so that will go to the existing overlay property tax assessors. And again, it's predominantly in the order of magnitude, about 44 cents of this dollar would go to the school district, 24 cents would go to the county. Right now, 17 cents, soon 21 cents will go to the fire district, 8 cents to the town, and then beyond that. So that money will go there. The question or maybe comment was that, well, there are going to be some additional services demanded on these particular agencies, and they are going not to receive any additional property tax revenue associated with this particular development. So comment on that. General comments on that is for the TIF and urban renewal law, any revenues that would have gone to the school districts for the school finance law are backfilled by the state of Colorado. As it relates to the county, as part of the submission to the county, as it relates to expanding the urban renewal plan, staff put together an impact report that you can see on the town website that identifies the impact that staff projects will be on the county, and based on a number of additional revenue streams, on some property tax growth outside of the urban renewal area that will logically happen if the Superior Town Center is successful. Areas around the Superior Town Center, but not in the Superior Town Center, may benefit from some additional growth. Those will all benefit the county. So that was commented on in the particular impact statement.
In the fire districts?
And the fire districts, there's in the draft urban renewal plan, there's a recognition that potentially up to 10 mills, which is roughly 10% of the property tax bill, potentially could go back to the fire district. So again, when we got down to 1 cent, a dollar, 10 cents, and 90 cents. It's that logic again.
Is there still some negotiation perhaps to be had if BBSD comes back and says, this is going to be an issue and we want to have the same kind of treatment as Rocky Mountain Fire? Is that still perhaps to come?
This plan has not been approved, and it will be approved in August. So, until that point, and during that public hearing on that particular date, yes. And again, town staff has met with county staff. Town board has received information from the county commissioners, and we've had, that level of dialogue already with the county.
And with the school districts, what are you seeing in terms of state backfill? Are they being pretty good about funding that with all the problems in the state?
So the question or comment was on school districts, and is the state being good on state backfill? I have no comment on that. I am not an expert in school finance law. Well, I think the benefit that we just saw with the, I'm not sure if it's the legislative council or whomever came out with the estimate last week that state revenues are going to be, I can't remember, an additional $400 million on top of what was initially projected. I can't remember which state law it is, but most of those revenues will go to the particular school districts. The future projections for state fiscal years 13-14 and 14-15 call for actually more revenues that were initially projected. So I can just speak from a global level from what we saw at the end of last week, that the state revenues picture is much more favorable than they thought it was 3 months ago. Where were we, Jeff? Again, TIF is not a new tax. It's not a newly assessed tax, but we're capturing incremental or new property taxes associated with new development. We're not doing anything with tax rates, sales or use tax rates, and new incremental revenues that result from the development, for the most part, go back in the development or into SURA to mitigate some of those blighted conditions. Others use TIF, Boulder County, say all the Boulder County communities that use it, Boulder, Lafayette, Longmont, Louisville, all use it. Many municipalities within the Denver metro area use it and have multiple project areas within their entities. And again, I think this, again, if you're interested, this DOLA website at the state would be a pretty good summary of folks who use urban renewal and TIF financing in the Denver metro area. So again, recognized mechanism for financing. All right, so here we're going to get into, and I'm sorry, this is kind of the last slide, but it speaks to, I think, some of the other questions we were holding is what obligation does the town of Superior have to pay either what's known as developer investment in this development or metro district investment in this particular development? The answer is zero. Essentially, how the agreements are structured, not essentially, how the agreements are structured is any new incremental revenues, and they're defined as pledged revenues in an agreement called the Public Finance Agreement. And again, that is on the town's webpage, or we can talk about it offline, but any of these new incremental sales and property tax revenues, and again, sales is just a very, very small portion of it, predominantly property tax revenues, would flow to the developer or the metro district to repay their principal investment in public infrastructure, not to exceed 75% of $145 million, or roughly $109 million. So let's talk about that. So the town is not issuing debt. The Urban Renewal Authority is not issuing debt. That's dissimilar to maybe some of the larger municipalities that you've seen do some activity here lately. Longmont's a pretty good example. They're doing redevelopment of the mall up there. They've identified an Urban Renewal Authority. They're going to use TIF financing, and there's going to be $30 million in debt that's going to be issued to do those particular public improvements. The City of Longmont essentially is going to issue that debt, and I'm not sure either through their Urban Renewal Authority or through what are called certificates of participation. They're issuing the debt. They are responsible then for payment of the debt. And in the scenario that the gentleman up there, I believe is Mr. McGinnis, was articulating, is what happens if that revenue does not come in to support that particular debt. In that particular case, the Longmonts of the world and many other larger municipalities, northern area, Broomfield, Westminster, Thornton, either their
municipality issues the debt, or their urban renewal authority that has implicit backing of the municipality issues the debt, that would be a scenario where they would be on the hook. We don't have quite frankly, we don't have the financial capacity to issue any debt. We're kind of soaked up debt issue-wise. So we have a situation where we're going to have a third party either issuing debt or identifying equity, coming up with money one way or another, a developer or a metro district. And what we are doing is identifying that any new incremental revenues, pledged revenues, that result from this particular development will flow back to that particular developer or to the metro district, and they will use that as a revenue source to pay off the debt. But that's where our obligation ends. So when a metropolitan, either 1, 2, or 3 metropolitan districts are created, debt is potentially issued in any and all of those metropolitan districts. Metropolitan districts who aren't even in creation yet, by state statute, they can only have an election in November, so I think we're looking at a November election to create the metropolitan district. And then after the metropolitan district is created, metropolitan district needs to come up with what's called a financing plan that must be submitted and approved to the town as it relates to how much debt is being issued, how is the debt going to be paid back, so a number of those particular questions we haven't even seen, and nor will we see until the district is in fact created. But we will look at that, we will comment on that, and we will identify that there will be some revenue that will be coming back from the town center. But that's our only obligation, to review the comment and say, as we get pledged revenue, it will come back to the metro district. It's going to be the metro district's responsibility to take that information, to use a investment banker or bond underwriter, someone to help them go to some sophisticated investors, go out to the bond market and say, we want to issue $1 million in debt. And we're going to have a number of repayment sources for that particular debt. One of this is going to be the pledged revenue sources, so they'll potentially get some bond investors who will buy that particular debt, recognizing that one of the repayment sources are these pledged revenues. But again, our only obligation, the town's only obligation, is to identify these pledged revenues, which we have, capture them, and remit them to the metro district or developer. And then as it relates to paying off those particular equity investments or debt issuances or wherever the developer or metro district comes up with their particular money, that will be one of potentially other revenue sources to pay that off. The other revenue source will be the incremental, so we're going to create a metro district is proposed to be created. Again, the analogy to use is very similar to District 2 and 3. Debt is issued, and then an additional property tax is placed on those particular property owners, like you have right now. So there'll be that revenue stream to pay off those particular obligations, as well as this pledged revenue stream. But that's where the town's obligation starts and ends. So questions? And I'm sorry, that was kind of a tertiary overview.
What happens at the end of the point that the debt is repaid? So those property taxes, do they now begin to flow back into the base to support all of the other infrastructure that hasn't been getting any of that taxes for all of the years for that? At some point, there's going to be more pressure on the schools and on the fire, that they're not getting any of that for that entire period that debt's being paid. Does it flow back after the debt's paid?
So the question is, after the debt is paid off, or essentially the tax increment financing obligation is paid off after the 25 years, what happens with that particular revenue? And the answer is it will flow back to the taxing entities. Again, the school district, there was a comment made, well, will it make the school district whole again? Well, the school district is being made whole through the State Finance Act, where the state is making the school district whole. But it's what's going to happen. Additionally, as I mentioned, there's these pledged revenues, these captured tax increment finance revenues, and then additionally, there is going to be some additional tax levy to support the bonds. So once those repayment costs, those bonds are paid off, the property tax revenues will revert back, and then the additional tax that are levied on the properties within that area as it relates to debt service, that will go away as well. like your debt for 2 and 3. You're going to continue to pay that as property tax owners within Superior until 2018. And after that, you'll see that 6% go away. Questions? Rita?
I would question, I guess I,
And if we're going to get to the point, now may be a good time.
okay.
That may be awesome, because I hate to inaccurately misstate.
I'm looking at your last slide here, the 75% of 145 million. I thought that the 145 million was 75% of the $198 million of projected costs for the infrastructure, for the public improvements or so-called infrastructure. So am I wrong there? How do you get from 198 down to 145? First question.
So, first question, and some of these numbers that come up, if you will look in the board, the planning commission has reviewed, the board has reviewed and approved creation of metro districts. We haven't done it yet because we can't elect until November. But within those particular documents, there was an estimate put forward on what potential public improvement costs were outstanding. And that's what was referenced there, the $198 million, up to $198 million in public improvements. Mostly as it relates to utilities, parking structures, and the standard road and earthwork type of expenses.
Plus community, civic and parks and things like that. So there's a lot of things in there.
Plus an additional $10 million in civic space.
Right.
So that's potentially, and I'm going to use round numbers if you don't mind, roughly $200 million in public improvements identified. During the negotiations between the developer and the board is identified, we want to put a cap on on those public improvements. And you say $200 million, we're going to say, no, not $200 million as part of those negotiations. The cap was identified as $145 million. And then in addition to that, additional negotiations are, of that $145 million, how much are these pledged revenues or these incremental sales and property taxes going to be used to support the public improvements and the developments? And that was the 75% number of the 145 number. So those numbers came as part of the negotiation between the two parties.
Okay, so 2 follow-up questions. So if it's going to cost $198 million projected to build out the STC, the Superior Town Center, I always have problems with that because I want to say Storage Technology Corporation.
Oh, I didn't even think of
STC,
that.
yeah. But so if that's the estimate, and now the town has said up to $145 million of bonds through these metro districts, and only 75% of that with a tax increment funding. So first, let's start with the $198 million. So then who will pay for that incremental difference between the 145 and the 198 that it's going to cost to put this wonderful infrastructure into the 157 acres over here?
So I heard your question. I'm going to kind of address it from a different angle.
Okay.
So out of this $200 million, we had identified that the pledged revenues will contribute $108 million.
Right. Uh-huh.
Then backing up, then the residual $90 million, difference between $110 million and $200 million.
Okay, that was going to be my second question then. So if you have flowed 145, okay, well, who pays for that?
So to answer your question, who pays for that? That is what comes from debt issuance by the metro districts in combination with, potentially.
But only up to 145 million.
Well, again, what we're talking about is 90 million is what we need to come up with, right? I have 200 million in total public improvements. The pledged revenues are going to contribute up to roughly 110 million.
Take the 10 million out for the community center and say $100 million, right? Okay.
Well,
I mean, you can, because that's an additive amount. Okay.
Let's say 100 million.
Yeah.
So as you just identified, then the metro districts could potentially bond up to 145 million.
And where will that other $45 million, how will it get serviced?
Again, 200 million total. Pledged revenue is 100 million. So the debt, what we have left is 100 million, right?
Right.
Metro districts potentially could issue up to 145 million in debt. So they're.
How will that difference be serviced?
Okay,
45,
so even 45 additional, and then where the additional money comes from is from the developer, from equity from the developer.
Okay, so then the developer then will be paying back that, servicing that debt themselves, that incremental $45 million over and above the $100 million. So tax increment will be funding $100 million, and the developer, if they floated through their districts that they've created, $145 million of bonds, will be actually servicing from their proceeds of this development that other $45 million. Because who's going to pay for that other $45 million? It's got to be, I guess, Randy, from your development corporation then, because it's not coming from our taxes. But it's in the Metro District, you're saying?
So again, if Metro District is issuing debt, that debt generally needs to be supported by a new property tax assessed against the property owners of that Metro District.
But you're only going to allow $100 million of it from property taxes. Where's the other debt servicing going to happen? The other $45 million from?
So again, kind of complicated items here, but we've got $100 million that is coming from the existing taxing entities, schools, Boulder County, Fire District.
Or just the $100 that are coming from the property
coming from the property.
That's easy.
Then good. Then what we'll have here.
It's incremental, it's new property tax, it's never been before, and it's going to be used now to fund $100 million. But where's the other $45 million? How is the other $45 million, if it's actually let, the bonds, where is that funding coming from?
Predominantly
Randy, do you
from-
understand what I'm asking?
More taxes from
I do.
the Metro District.
Oh, I answered the question earlier. It's equity. It's developer equity.
Well, we not only have developer equity, but as the gentleman was saying up there, you're going to have a new Metro District.
Well, if it's developer equity,
gonna have-
then it's not a bond.
You're going to have a new Metro District that is going to be charging a new property tax rate on the property tax owners within the Superior Town Center.
Okay, okay. We'll take this up afterwards, not tonight, but I'd like to have a meeting with you, because I'm not clear on this. When you use the 198 is what it's going to cost. Who's paying for that? Don't need an answer right now, because we'll be here all night if we're trying to answer it. But, I haven't been able to work these numbers out in that then the 75%, what I thought was 145 million, now you're saying that's 109. That's great, I love that. And, but it's just who's paying for all this. And if it's equity, then it's not a bond, a debt, unless I guess, no, I just figured it out.
Okay,
You're going to loan it to the Metro District, and then you're going to get, no? Okay.
So I think we can certainly talk offline, love to do that. I may not be clear. I think if we could just take a few minutes, it might be beneficial to have the developer comment on the.
No, I would like our staff to comment.
Okay, well, I've tried to comment.
Yeah, so that's why I would say, let's talk about it then.
Sure, and my point was going to be, was have the developer comment, and then the staff could certainly maybe give
Well, I'm not opposed to that, I'm just saying.
different perspective, and we will, Jeff and I will opine on whether or not we feel what Randy is telling us is what we interpret as part of the agreements.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Unless we need additional clarification. So, Randy, if you can just take 2 minutes, maybe from a different perspective identified, and again, this is kind of staff presentation. We're the board representatives, and we will give them counsel, and if we can comment on what Randy says here.
Right. So the one point of clarification is that all of the public infrastructure will be funded by us, by the developer first. And the bonds, as you went through correctly, the process of issuing bonds, whether they're issued based on SURA tax increment or whether they're issued based upon a portion of Metro District tax increment for the Superior Town Center Metropolitan District, the portion that's only on the property, the 157 acres, and cannot go beyond the 157 acres, those two bonds, or those two sources of payment for bonds are only reimbursing us for the cost of the infrastructure. We build the infrastructure, we dedicate it to the town, and when there are payments because there have been houses sold or commercial properties occupied or constructed, after the fact, bonds can be issued and repay us for a portion of the public infrastructure that we have all dedicated to the town. So we can only spend the money to build public infrastructure. We will dedicate that public infrastructure to the town, roads, streets, parks, the land for the civic space, we dedicate that to the town now owns it, and we'll get reimbursed a portion, some portion that's completely our risk, we will get reimbursed a portion out of the bonds that can be issued. If as some people have alluded, if nothing's built, and we've put up a bunch of roads and dedicated the roads to the town, and there's nothing built, we won't be able to issue any bonds, and we will suffer the consequences. That's one reason it's very important to us that we have a project that's marketable and feasible and meets the demand in the market. Using the maximum numbers, the 198 million, the maximum is roughly 109 million could be reimbursed if everything went according to plan. A maximum of 109 million could be reimbursed using the SURA portion of the tax increment, and another 36 million could be reimbursed using the Metropolitan District portion of tax increment, and the difference there is also developer equity. So even in the best scenario and in our best scenarios, we are still funding a significant portion of the public infrastructure that we're dedicating to the town.
Thanks for the clarification. And again, please come on up. The scenario, again, is very similar to what happened in the marketplace, albeit on a smaller level, but developer invested $21 million of their money for those particular public improvements, and that's what's being reimbursed. Sir.
Hey, Brent Bickle, El Dorado. Okay, so something struck me with your presentation. I know we've been talking about a lot of details and a lot of numbers and a lot of technical questions, but I had a sort of a basic question, and I just want to make sure I absolutely understand it. So Superior Metropolitan District 1, is that anyone that gets a water bill from the town?
That is correct.
Okay, so I get a water bill from the town, so I'm in Superior Metropolitan District number 1. How many customers, do you know roughly, does the Metropolitan District have? Anybody?
We have roughly 4,500 customers. Number of connections is less than that because of the horizon, so maybe 3,800 connections.
All right, so if we had $25 million, which is what you're saying the water district currently owes right now.
Outstanding debt of the water, sewer, and the storm drainage district is $25 million.
Divided by 3,800 households, that would means that I, as a homeowner who's part of the Superior Metropolitan District, owes $6,578 that I'm liable for those bonds. Is that correct, technically, on average?
And again, breaking out on an individual home basis, what supports that particular debt? There are two payment sources, that support that particular debt. One are the rates, fees, and charges that you're charged as a homeowner. So that potentially could be a revenue source that is needed to pay that particular debt, and the other is the sales and use tax revenue that comes from the town. But you, as it relates to your particular property, when we start to talk about GO debt or debt against your particular property, that is not a payment source that is not identified in the bond covenants as a way to pay off that particular debt.
But if the cost of the water district increased substantially, they would increase the cost of my water bill.
That is correct.
And then I would either have to pay that, which means I would have to pay that money, the $6,578, or not have any water or sewer service.
You would have to pay your new bill, not a new $6,000 bill, but I
would have to pay for those costs.
Between the water generated by the utility customers, so your water bill, that's responsible for paying for those costs, as well as what's known as, we have a revenue share agreement between Superior Metro District number 1 and the town of Superior.
Right.
And I didn't want to go into this detail, but it's very relevant here. We transfer roughly $1.5 million a year from the town, from the general fund to the water district, to the utility district, The revenue share agreement actually calls for the utilities to have they have the ability to take actually roughly 2/3 of all sales and use tax revenues. So last year, if the utilities needed it, they could, per these bond covenants, have taken up to $3.5 million, where only 1.5 was in fact transferred. So again, this sales tax sharing agreement comes into play to this as well.
Okay. So that answers my first question, but in a sense, we are, because our water bills do relate in part to the amount of that debt, and because I'm a customer of the water utility, that means that I'm partially responsible for it. Or I mean that I would, because I'm a customer, we pay for it to an extent.
To an extent. You as a customer have an obligation, but then the town, the Superior, with the revenue share agreement with SMD number 1, has an obligation to transfer sales and use tax revenues to cover that as well.
Okay, so if this project is approved, then that $6,578 goes away. I mean, essentially that debt is paid off, which means that would be less money that I have to pay in my water bill, theoretically, for that debt.
Yes. And said another way, we would intend to use these one-time tap fees to pay off the existing debt, and that would put less pressure on the other two revenue sources that are currently supporting that utility operation, your rates, fees, and charges, as well as the general fund transfer.
Okay. And then for the new development, when they form their municipal districts, I'm not liable for that debt in any way.
That is correct. It's the same scenario that's where we have some overlay, where we currently have what's known as Metro District Number 2, which essentially encompasses the residential area north of Colton of Rock Creek Ranch. There's some debt outstanding there, $3-4 million. The property owners in that particular area are the only ones responsible for that particular debt, nobody else in town. So expanding that analogy, yes, if new debt is created for these new districts, only the property owners in those districts are liable for that debt.
So to me, as a property owner in Superior Metropolitan District 1, it could be $90 million, $100, it could be an infinity dollars, and it doesn't really matter to me.
Unless no one ever moves in there because they're going to owe so much money and it's a big dust pile.
You will never be, right, it's nothing our obligation, but ultimately, I think the point's well taken. In the scenario where, it's not your financial obligation, I'll leave it at that. You're absolutely correct. It's the financial obligation of the developer who has an equity interest there, and then potentially the issuance of debt by those metro districts.
So at least for me, I would expect to get a financial benefit by the paying off of the bonds for the water treatment plant with the new development, but I wouldn't have any liability from the issuance of the new debt.
I think that's exactly the point that we've presented throughout here.
Okay, well, that sounds good to me. Thank you.
Thank you. That was probably a much better way than me babbling. Thank you.
I just have, I know we're done with time tonight.
We can take as much time, so that we can take as much time as we need, and we can either do it in this forum, or if Mr. Zell or others want to meet with myself or the manager or whomever, we'd be more than happy in whatever form you'd like.
So I really appreciate you taking the time to go over this all again. And, you're always so well-spoken and easy to present things in such an easy-to-understand way. One thing that would be really helpful to me was, while you went over the STC ongoing annual expenses, such as the BOCO sheriff, field maintenance, snow removal, street maintenance, grounds maintenance, town facility maintenance, if we could see the associated costs for the current town costs for those services. I know I could probably look it up myself maybe on the budget, but it would be nice to see side by side what the Superior Town Center costs are for these things and what the current town costs are for these items. So
that would be a great follow-up, awesome first good follow-up that we will get that information and post it on the website.
And then the other thing that's just kind of confusing to compare, we say we took $21 million to build the Superior Marketplace, and we're getting all of that paid back by sales tax. I'm curious, with this new proposal, this new model, that we're going to have that paid back with a combination of property and sales tax, and if we have some estimates of revenue for those, what the amount will be for property tax versus sales tax to pay back the $145 million or whatever the TIF is?
We can certainly get the revenue estimates as it relates to what will be generated, but again, that revenue, just to be clear, is we're not paying directly debt for that. We are capturing that revenue and then remitting it back to the developer for their financial exposure.
But just what that breakdown is in property and sales tax to be collected to pay back that.
Almost all property. No. $145 million is totally separate. Totally separate.
So again, Trustee Barrett's, but I think your question is, what is our estimate of incremental property tax and sales tax to be collected on that particular site, right?
Yes.
Okay, so
That's the
yes,
question.
so we can answer that.
Okay, and then there was one other, this is probably not a question for you.
Oh, sorry.
So I can send it to Matt or Andrew. What happens if the approved plan, to the approved plan that's before the board currently, if the developer can't get funded after he creates his SMD districts, what happens to that plan that's now been platted, and what happens to that if the funding doesn't come through on this?
So we'll certainly follow up with that one as well. Thank you.
Is that something you can address tonight?
It's kind of a policy.
Because I was going to ask the same question too.
I think it's more than a financial related item as well. So I would rather, have some dialogue with the manager and get you a very thorough response, if that's fair.
What defines the duration of the TIF for the SURA? Is it the sooner of 109 or 25 years, or is it something else?
So it's 25 years max, but if in fact you meet your obligation of eliminating that blighted condition and paying off those expenses associated with eliminating that blighted condition, it could be sooner than that.
And is the 108, 109 the only obligation that has been considered so far for the TIF?
That is correct. Just so we're clear, the agreement calls for roughly $109 million. That's the principal amount. And then there will be accrued interest on that, exactly the same that we have in the marketplace. And then there's additional provision of up to 1% of bond issuance costs. So when we have someone issuing debt to help service this, those are the three provisions. But the 109 is the basis for all that.
So if it all gets wrapped up in 8 years, then the additional incremental revenue starts going back to the other tax.
Yeah, once your financial obligation has been met, that goes away. And even if your financial obligation is not met in 25 years, those incremental revenues go away.
Yep. And one question you may not be able to answer, I'm not sure if you considered this, but what happens if we get, say a Calmonte situation, for lack of a better term. We get roads built, we get a couple houses started, and then gone. Every developer loses funding, things go away. Are there any particular liabilities that, from a financial perspective, that the town needs to be concerned about and address, or is it more just an eyesore that we have to deal with?
I would argue, the town officials from the board down to town staff telling the citizens no one likes to see that situation. And I think most importantly in that scenario, the developer doesn't want to see that situation because they are going to bear the financial burden as it relates to that. So as it relates to this particular development, we have potentially up to $200 million in public improvements. And Mr. Goodson may comment on this, but my assumption is that the developer is not going to install $200 million in public improvements at the beginning. It's going to be a phased construction approach. So essentially, the first phase of construction may include, and I can't remember, in the magnitude of 10 to 15 million of 22 million of public improvements. Even in that first particular phase, it's not putting in the public improvements, which would be predominantly earthwork, roads, utility infrastructure, and then hoping that someone will buy a pad site and move forward. I think they have a commitment of a couple of large users to be part of that. So what we're looking at is an incremental phased approach, not to put in all the infrastructure. We'll only put in a portion of infrastructure. So there's some safety net there, combined with the fact that you have some users that are going to be coming in that are going to be generating this incremental property tax revenue. And then let's talk about the town's responsibility here. So RC Superior LLC will build the public improvements. The town reviews those public improvements from a plan perspective. They put it in, we do field inspection of those particular improvements. Again, this is all on them. And then at some point in time, we'll say, okay, these improvements look good, let's start the warranty period. So they've been installed, we've inspected, and we say, good to go, and let's start the warranty period. Our warranty period is 2 years. So again, the developer still has the obligation of maintaining that infrastructure for a 2-year period of time, and we have a letter of credit surety to support this. And then and only after that point in time are we responsible, are they dedicated to the town, and are we responsible for the maintenance? So in specific to your question on Chem 90, for example, yes, it is an eyesore, but again, none of those public improvements have been accepted by the town, so it's not our responsibility. So the bank, it was FDIC and FDIC out of Kimball, Nebraska, who were responsible for some of those public improvements, and then the developer, the housing developer we're talking with right now to continue that particular development, we've identified our punch list item, and they have agreed to bring those public improvements up to par. So an incremental approach, a warranty period, an inspection period, all of that helps to mitigate, I think, the concern you've identified.
Cool, thank you.
You're welcome. You're next.
There have been a couple of questions of the developer, and I just want to emphasize our website is www.superiortowncenter.com. My contact information is on that website. Larry Hirschfield's contact information is on that site. We have a bunch of we have questions and answers and details on our website, but please call me or email me if anyone has questions that I could help answer. I'll also be around, and I have business cards to pass out. Thank you very much.
Margaret? I think Margaret had. Margaret, can you maybe come up, please? Thank you. Or, I'm sorry, Ms. Parrish.
Thanks, Paul, for doing this again. My question is, could you envision any point in the future that the developer might have trouble selling the bonds from the MDA or from the developer, that they would come to the town and ask them for support for those bonds, either to improve their bond rating, maybe to get a better rate, or any of those sort of options? I know sometimes, you talked about Longmont and Lafayette and different commitments that towns have made. So I would see that being anything from a moral obligation that the town would assume that debt to an actual commitment to assume that debt, if just to improve the financing picture for that.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's never been envisioned that the town would provide any sort of either formal or tacit backing of that particular debt. Our vision is we would remit the pledged revenues as required in the agreement, and that's the extent of our agreement as it relates to that particular debt. So we're not envisioning a moral obligation pledge to enhance that initial debt.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
In the public finance agreement, there's, in this recital section, it talks about substantial public infrastructure and public facilities required to serve the proposed project. And in parentheses, it says, which may include off-site improvements. So in the comprehensive plan, there's roundabouts and the South Coal Creek Drive re-engineering project, various capital improvements like that. It's not clear if there will have to be any pool expansion outside of the town center. And I'm curious about how those off-site developments or public improvements might get funded. Is it part of what the $145 million or the $108 million? Is it part of the $10 million that the town's obligated to issue bonds for? Can you discuss that at all?
Very briefly, as a point of clarification, that the 10 million reference for civic space, again, the town is not issuing debt for that. It would be the Metro District issuing that, and then the town being the beneficiary of those proceeds, however the town feels to use those particular proceeds.
Because it shows up under the section town's obligations
In,
in the public finance agreement.
I think it, well, so let me look at that, and then we'll respond to that, because I have a different vision of that, so, I don't want to get in directly to the public finance agreement. I think to some degree as it relates to, some of these either off-site improvements, or maybe, as you mentioned, extension of Coal Creek Drive, I think some of that is going to be worked out. The developer has submitted their PD plan amendment, and the board and the developer are going through comments on that now, and there may, who knows, there may be some actual changes to that particular plan between the PD plan amendments and after that is, depending upon the vote on that, and if that is approved, it'll lead into what's called a final development plan. So in that particular case, these public improvements will continue to be reviewed and finalized. So I think at that point in time, we'll have a much better idea of truly what these public improvements are. As it relates to funding off-site improvements, as it relates to pools, things of that nature, I think I'm going to have to give you a response offline, but that is not going to be included in this, in the developer's obligation, for example, to expand South Pool, for example. I don't envision that.
So could you tell us what qualifies as off-site improvements?
We will get back with you on that one. I'm sorry I can't answer that directly, but we will get back with you on that one. You're welcome. Thank you. Please.
Just two questions. When you go into the more detail on the financing side of things, can you tell us what the break-even interest rate is, so that the interest rate to finance, to pay for the interest on the $145 million that comes from the incremental property tax revenues, what that number is compared to what issuance rate they'll have to do on the bonds, so that then we can track where they're going to have to issue at to where there could be a detriment ultimately out there from the financial markets?
We can think about that. Now, there is a provision. So when the developer was proposing metro districts be created, and when that happens, what is submitted for the town for review is something called the service plan. Within that particular service plan, there are some financial requirements or limitations for that particular service plan, and within that document, it identifies a maximum interest rate for these particular obligations at 9%. But let us maybe think about some other
So then if it's above 9%, then what? So let's say the treasury rates continue higher, credit spreads blow out because other municipalities default like Detroit did. What happens then, I guess?
The maximum, I guess, interest expense that ultimately can be borne by the property taxpayer. So to some degree, an ability to limit how much interest expense can be burdened on those property taxpayers is 9%. So I would imagine any delta above that would have to be absorbed by some other entity, but it would not be absorbed by the metro district. That's my initial response, but that's one that I think bears some initial thought, and we will respond to that one as well.
And then we talked about the property tax abatements earlier. Can you comment on whether there's any other hiring tax credits that you're offering to Cornerstone or any other retail entities or training credits or other things that are going to be a drag on the town at all?
At this point in time, we have no other formal agreement. Some of those items that you referenced actually are very good, solid tax credits, but then they would be at the state level where it'd be a credit off the state income tax type of thing. But at this point in time, we don't have any other formal agreements other than the $2 million reimbursement of incremental property tax revenues for the ICE facility.
And there's no requirement in your agreement with the developer to provide any additional incentives at the town level to attract anybody into that retail space?
No requirement.
Okay.
Brandy?
Paul, the $2 million that the town pledged to TBI, does that also get deducted from the pledged increment for the town center, the SURA pledged increment?
So the question was the $2 million that is pledged for BVI for their particular improvement, does that get reduced from the pledged town increment, so reduced of the $109 million? This may be a leading question. I don't know the answer to that. Randy says it does, but I do not know the answer to that, so staff will respond to that particular item. So I apologize for not knowing that answer. Please.
So, at the meeting the other night, there was one comment that was made, I don't quite understand it. It was around some of what would be dedicated to the town. And I think it was around, a comment was made with relationship to the baseball field. And so there was some question about that, and it said, and I think Randy, you indicated, we're just dedicating space. And the town can use it however they want. So in your projections, if there's certain ways we want to do that, like the amphitheater, or the baseball field lighting, or other things like that, is that in your projections to say that is the responsibility of the town to have those amenities the way the town wants them? Because I just understood they're dedicating the land, and however we wanted to, whatever we want to do with it, we'd have to pay for it.
So,
Can you explain that?
my understanding, and again, some of this is maybe more land use, but dedicating the land, Metro District will issue up to $10 million of debt, which the town can invest in what are known as civic spaces. So it could be, let's say it's enhancement of some of that land into a form of ball field. If in fact that happens, we've arguably got the capital from the issuance of debt from the Metro District, and then as a public amenity, that responsibility would fall on us ultimately to program and to maintain. And to some degree, I hope I captured some of those expenses and some of those ongoing operating expenses. The new water expense, the $200,000 for grounds maintenance. So those are the new operating expenses which would be associated with those enhanced public amenities. And please, if I didn't answer your question, please, I can try to clarify. Any other questions? And again, tonight is not the end here. Jeff and I have our contact information. The manager, the assistant manager, all the board members, all their contact information is on the webpage. We, encourage any additional questions. I mean, I learned more things than I care to admit tonight. It's a very complicated process, but we continue to learn and we continue to try to be forthright and articulate what we feel the impact financially for the town will be. I want to thank you for your time this evening, and again, please feel free to contact with any additional questions, and we will follow up on the webpage, hopefully relatively soon, with all those residual questions. Again, thank you very much. Thanks. Talk too much, Bob?